They say one email can end a career. I didn't believe that until I watched it happen. Not to me, but to the woman who thought she'd buried me alive. It began with a single. CC. Harmless. Routine. Except she copied HR on 27. Client reports. All signed under my name the day that email hit my inbox. The air in the office felt heavy. You could sense the tension humming between the glass walls of the M&A floor. A mixture of espresso, ambition, and quiet fear. We were all hunters pretending not to smell blood. My name is Ava Sinclair, and I work for Halden & March, a boutique firm specializing in corporate acquisitions. To outsiders, we were the picture of precision. Sharp suits, sharp smiles, sharper knives. Inside, it was a chessboard where everyone thought they were the queen. And then there was her, Clara Voss, my colleague. My shadow, my rival wrapped in perfume and politeness. She had that unnerving calm, the kind people mistake for confidence but is really control. For months she'd been circling, inching closer to my accounts, my clients, my position, and I'd been watching, quietly, letting her believe she was winning. But when her email arrived, the one that CC'd HR and client relations, something in the game shifted. The subject line read, Urgent, 27 client communications, compliance review. At first glance, it looked like a procedural check, something routine before an audit. But as I opened the attachments, I realized what she'd done. She'd flagged every single client under my portfolio, attaching evidence of mismanagement, implying that I'd jeopardized millions in investor trust. 27 clients, 27 small fires, all pointing to one person, me. I stared at the screen, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my jaw. Every report was doctored just enough to raise suspicion. A missing timestamp here, an altered signature there. Nothing conclusive, but enough to paint a pattern. And HR was CC'd, which meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a bullet. Fired publicly. I didn't respond. Not yet. You don't fight back in panic. Not when someone's showing you their hand. You let them think it's working. So I sat there, letting the room buzz around me, letting the whispers start. Because I knew something Clara didn't. Something buried deep inside Halden & March's structure. The investors. The clauses. The silent agreements that could make or break careers in seconds. She thought she was burning my reputation, but she'd just lit a fuse connected straight to her own. That night, I didn't sleep. I went back to the office after everyone had left. Lights dim, cleaning crew humming in the background. My desk still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and panic. I opened every client log, every audit trail, and began connecting dots Clara didn't even know existed. Her timing was too perfect. Her language too calculated. She wasn't just reporting errors. She was planting evidence, the kind that could trigger investor panic. And that was her mistake. Because in a firm like ours, when investors panic, someone always pays. By dawn, I wasn't scared anymore. I was curious how far she'd go, and how quietly I could take her down before she realized I'd been watching her game unfold. She thought she'd buried me under 27 fires, but she'd forgotten something fundamental about fire. It spreads. The morning after Clara's email, the office felt sterile, too bright, too calm, like the silence before a courtroom verdict. People were polite, overly so, their smiles stretched thin as if afraid to look directly at me. I didn't blame them. HR had scheduled a routine compliance review for noon, and everyone knew what that meant. Someone's head was about to roll. When I entered the boardroom, Clara was already there. She greeted me with a soft smile, her eyes flicking over me like I was a file to be closed. She wore navy, calculated professionalism, and on the table beside her sat a stack of printed reports. My reports. Morning, Ava, she said, voice smooth as silk. You must have seen the email. I just thought it was better to get ahead of any misunderstandings. The word hung in the air, sweet and venomous. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat across from her, placing my tablet on the table. HR joined us a few minutes later. Dana, the type who spoke in compliance codes and smiled like a politician. She shuffled through the papers, eyes scanning for numbers that didn't add up. tone that didn't match policy. Clara's flagged inconsistencies in 27 client interactions, Dana began, mainly around authorization chains and timestamp discrepancies. Ava will need your version of events. I could feel Clara's gaze, confident, certain. She thought this was her victory lap. So I gave her what she wanted. I nodded slowly and said, "Of course, I'll provide full documentation." But I didn't explain, not yet. Because while Clara had been manufacturing chaos, I'd been documenting everything, quietly. Every project transfer, every client message she'd borrowed, every late-night revision she made to the shared folders. I knew where the bodies were buried, digitally speaking. That evening, when everyone left, I stayed behind again. I didn't touch my computer at first. I just stood by the window overlooking the city, glass towers glowing gold and silver in the dusk. It reminded me why I'd come here in the first place, not to win, not even to lead, but to survive in a world built on power games and backroom whispers. I opened the investor portal and started reviewing the quarterly partnership reports. Halden and March had an investor clause, a buried one, that protected partners from reputational risk during active audits. It meant that if an associate's misconduct triggered client panic, the partner overseeing them would be liable, not the associate. And Clara? She'd copied every senior partner on that email chain. She didn't realize she'd implicated herself in every client fire she tried to light under me. That clause was the detonator. I just needed to time the explosion. By midnight, I had a plan. Not revenge, not yet. Just a strategy. Revenge is messy when it's loud, but when it's silent, deliberate, and precise, it becomes art. I sent one short email before leaving that night. Just one line to the partner overseeing both our divisions. Regarding the flagged clients, recommend a full audit before investor review next quarter. No panic. No accusation. Just a seed. By morning, that seed would grow roots. And when the audit came, the truth about Clara's fabrications would find daylight, along with the clause she'd unknowingly triggered. The boardroom would see her fire. I'd make sure of it. By the next morning, the atmosphere in the office had shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. HR's tone was softer, the partners' doors were closed, and whispers followed Clara instead of me. The audit had begun. It started quietly, like a storm forming behind the clouds. Internal compliance had been instructed to verify all documentation and client interactions tied to Q3 M&A accounts, which, in translation, meant every deal touched by Clara or me was under the microscope. I watched her that day, pretending not to notice the way her smile strained. She was still playing the role of the concerned colleague, stopping by my desk, offering sympathy disguised as civility. "You know how these things go, Ava," she said sweetly. "Sometimes it's just about perception. If we can show transparency, this will blow over." I looked up from my screen, met her gaze, and smiled faintly. "Transparency's a good thing," I said. "It always reveals what's real." She didn't like that. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, like a glitch in her mask. By afternoon, compliance officers began quietly collecting data. They weren't subtle about it, the kind of quiet everyone hears. Files were being mirrored, emails archived. I could see their mirrored drives flashing across the network dashboard, a digital footprint of suspicion. And I knew exactly where they were headed, because I'd guided them there. Weeks before this all began, I'd built a private archive, a mirror of the shared drive, complete with timestamps and version histories. Every time Clara edited a file, I logged it. Every time she sent a client update, I saved the original. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival in a firm where loyalty had a shelf life. Around 3 p.m., the head of compliance, Andrew Locke, called me in. His tone was neutral, clipped, too careful. "We're noticing some inconsistencies between your originals and the versions uploaded later," he said, tapping through his screen. "Can you explain why these edits occurred under both your user IDs?" "That's impossible," I said calmly. "I haven't touched those documents since submission." He turned his monitor slightly. "Then someone used your credentials." The words hung there like the faint smell of smoke before a fire alarm. I didn't smile, but I wanted to. "You'll find the access logs show the edits occurred during restricted hours. between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. I wasn't in the system then. He blinked. You have proof? I keep activity receipts, I said. Personal policy. When I left his office, I could feel Clara watching me. Her perfect posture, her stillness. But her eyes were restless. She knew something wasn't aligning the way she'd planned. The walls were starting to close, and for the first time I saw fear in the way she typed. Quick, almost frantic. By the end of the week, compliance had escalated the findings to the partner board. The term data manipulation had started floating in emails. HR froze both our accounts temporarily, pending review. But it didn't matter. My part was done. The audit was now its own organism, feeding on what it found. What Clara didn't know was that one of her late-night edits had triggered an internal alert months ago. A backup system only partners could access. And those alerts went to the investor compliance division, not HR. It was out of her hands now. That Friday, I stayed late again. The office was dark, save for the glow of the skyline outside. I opened my tablet and reviewed the internal chat logs one more time. The quiet digital trail that told the story she thought she'd erased. Client complaints. Revisions without authorization. Memos coincidentally backdated to make me look negligent. It was all there. But here's where things got interesting. One of the clients she'd flagged, a mid-tier tech acquisition worth $48 million, was directly tied to an investor fund managed by Halden and March's silent partner, Marcellon Equity. And Marcellon Equity's contract contained the investor clause, the one that made any partner accountable for compliance failures under their supervision. The same clause Clara had unknowingly triggered when she copied all the partners on that email. She'd burned her own bridge. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I received an invitation to an emergency board meeting. Investor Assurance Review, scheduled for Monday at 8 a.m. Mandatory attendance. Clara would be there too. That weekend, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even rest. I reviewed every report, every timestamp, every discrepancy until I could recite them from memory. Because this wasn't about defending myself anymore. It was about precision. Clara had started a fire in the middle of the firm. Now I was going to hand the investors the oxygen they needed to watch her reputation burn. Neatly, legally, and without ever raising my voice. The boardroom on Monday morning looked different. Not physically. Same glass walls, same walnut table polished to reflection. But in energy. There was tension in the air, sharp enough to cut through silk. Everyone was too quiet, too careful. The partners sat in a line across the far end, eyes cold and deliberate. Clara sat 2 seats away from me, posture perfect, a poised mask of concern. But I noticed her hand, fingers twitching slightly, betraying her nerves. The meeting began with Andrew from compliance presenting his findings. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. Charts, audit trails, timestamp logs. Then he said the words I'd been waiting for. We discovered multiple instances of document manipulation under shared account access. The edits originated outside authorized hours using Mrs. Sinclair's credentials. However, cross-verification shows they were executed from a separate workstation, assigned to Ms. Voss. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. Clara blinked. Slow, deliberate. Then leaned forward, feigning confusion. That can't be right, she said softly. There must be an error. I would never. Andrew clicked the remote again. Another slide appeared. Security footage from 12:47 a.m. corroborates access to Ms. Sinclair's system by Ms. Voss's ID keycard. Her face drained of color. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as whispers spread like cracks in ice. One of the partners, Mr. Delaney, stoic, cautious, spoke first. Clara, are you saying you were here, after hours, making edits on your colleagues' accounts? I was reviewing compliance risks, she stammered, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. Ava asked me to double-check her documentation before submission. All eyes turned to me. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I simply said, that's not true. And then I opened my folder. Inside were printed access logs, email threads, version histories. I'd highlighted every instance where she'd duplicated, altered, or reassigned ownership. Each line had a timestamp, each edit a trail. I'd even marked one keynote at the bottom of the final page. Unauthorized changes coinciding with Clara Voss's compliance review submissions. Andrew took the pages, scanning them, then placed them neatly in front of the partners. The room felt colder now. One of the senior partners, the one copied in her original HR email, exhaled slowly. "Clara, these documents you sent to HR, they triggered our investor review clause." Her head snapped up. "Investor clause?" He nodded grimly. "Halden and March is obligated to disclose internal irregularities to investors during an active audit. You involved 27 clients. That action classifies as reputational risk." She froze, eyes wide. "But I was just protecting the firm." "No," Delaney cut in, his voice flat. "You weaponized policy." The weight of that statement settled over her like a verdict. Her facade finally cracked. The calm professionalism she'd worn like armor started to crumble, her lips tightening, breath quickening, the shine in her eyes shifting from control to panic. She realized what I had known from the beginning, that by looping HR and the partners, she'd unintentionally tied her name to every account she accused me of mishandling, and under the investor clause that made her liable for any resulting instability. The partners exchanged looks. Legal whispered something to HR, and Clara, she just stared at the table, jaw clenched, as her carefully built empire began to dissolve piece by piece. In that moment, she didn't look like my rival. She looked like someone standing in front of a mirror, watching her reflection fracture. And yet, even then, she turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did this." I met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "No," I said quietly. "You did." The board adjourned without ceremony. Clara was escorted out an hour later, quietly, efficiently, with no scene. Just the sound of her heels fading down the marble hall, like punctuation at the end of a long, cruel sentence. But even as she disappeared, I couldn't shake the chill that lingered. Because in this world, downfall is never final. It's just deferred, and I had a feeling hers wasn't done burning yet. When the board cleared and Clara's heels had faded into the corridor, the real work began. I didn't want a spectacle, I wanted inevitability. Revenge that arrives like a ledger closing, silent, precise, irreversible. Revenge, in my world, is a contract. It requires witnesses, dates, signatures, and the slow accumulation of incontrovertible facts. So I built one. Step 1. Consolidate the timeline. If you want someone held accountable, you don't hand them a feeling, you hand them a paper trail. I spent nights stitching together every timestamp, every draft, every misplaced approval. I cross-referenced client calls with recorded minutes, matched version numbers to IP addresses, and mapped the edits to Clara's workstation logins. Where there were gaps, I found backups, client-side confirmations, forwarded emails from junior analysts, even innocuous thank you notes from assistants that contained time markers. Each piece was a stitch in a seam that only a slow hand could sew. Step 2. Weaponize the investor clause, legally but quietly. Marcellon Equity didn't panic without reason. They responded to abrasion, not accusation. The clause promised that any unresolved compliance events affecting client confidence would trigger a formal partner review, and, if necessary, funding reallocation. I didn't want their fury. I wanted their bureaucracy. So I fed it exactly what it needed: documented risk. I prepared a dossier that read less like an indictment and more like an audit brief. Objective facts, clearly sourced and impossible to dismiss as vendetta. Investors respond to clarity. I gave them nothing else. Step 3. Cultivate allies, not soldiers. Revenge is easier when other people's interests align with yours. I quietly briefed a few people I trusted. Andrew in compliance, because he hated sloppy work. Delaney, because he owed me a favor from a deal I'd salvaged last year. And one junior partner who had quietly been losing faith in Clara's results at any cost approach. I never asked them to take sides. I simply handed them questions their roles demanded they answer. When you lead people to do their jobs, the outcome looks like natural justice. Step 4. Let psychology do the rest. I knew Clara's greatest strength was control, so I removed it in the most intimate way. Information. I leaked nothing, but I let her see the perimeter closing. A seated comment here. The investors did request extra verification. An unexpected glance at a mirrored drive there. A copied memo that landed on her desk by mistake. Small tremors make confident people stumble. She began to double-check, to over-explain, to leave footprints. Step 5. Time the investor intervention to avoid rumors. Public drama feeds rumor. Rumor invites legal theatrics. I needed a formal mechanism that would become the firm's official narrative, so I coordinated, indirectly, the audit's cadence. Compliance findings compiled, partner review scheduled, investor notification prepared. I didn't speak the words go. I ensured that every procedural box that needed checking was ticked, so the moment the investors read the dossier, their response would be governed by clause, not passion. Mechanics over melodrama. Step 6. Protect my future while exposing hers. I prepared a clarity packet for the partners, a clean set of my originals, signed off, time-stamped, with corroborating client confirmations. I respected the firm's processes because I wanted the firm to survive this, without Clara embedded in it. My goal wasn't to burn Halden and March to ash. It was to remove the rot without uprooting the tree. That required me to be scrupulous. No hyperbole, no theatrical allegations, just an undeniable record. Step 7. Press when the law and the contract both bend in my favor. Contracts are indifferent. Law is slow. The investor clause accelerated both. When Marcelon's legal team reviewed the materials, their next steps would be procedural. Notify partners, demand remediation, and if needed, reassign oversight. I structured everything so those procedural steps would lead to one predictable place, Clara's liability. Not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because the firm needed to insulate itself from risk, and the clause demanded an accountable name. I didn't want vengeance that tasted like victory. I wanted consequence that felt like closure. So my plan was surgical. Remove the threat, restore confidence, and ensure no one could rewrite the ledger later. In the weeks that followed, the plan behaved like a well-engineered mechanism. Compliance moved with bureaucratic speed. Investors asked composed, precise questions. Partners convened in closed rooms. Each time the conversation circled back to the same point: who initiated the cascade that created reputational exposure? The answers pointed, inexorably, in one direction. Clara fumbled. She tried legal counsel, then silence, then public explanations that only made her look smaller. She hadn't planned for the slow, patient accumulation of facts. She'd expected a moment, a dramatic reveal. She failed to see that the kind of fire she'd tried to light could be contained and analyzed, dissected down to origin and cause, and in the end, the most devastating part for her was that it wasn't me who burned her. It was the firm's own rules, and her choice to weaponize them. 3 weeks later, the air in Halden and March no longer hummed with competition. It trembled with anticipation. Everyone knew something was coming. The investor board had gone unusually quiet. HR avoided eye contact. Even the interns moved like ghosts through the hallways. When the summons arrived, investor clause invocation, partner review committee, no one had to ask who it was about. The meeting was set for Friday, 9 a.m. sharp. Only the essential personnel were called: senior partners, legal counsel, and me. Clara was invited too, of course. She still technically held her title. That morning, the elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. The mirrored walls reflected fragments of my face, calm but detached, as if I were watching myself from a distance. I'd rehearsed this moment so many times in my head, yet when the doors opened, I felt none of the thrill I expected. Just inevitability. Inside the conference room, the investors sat like a tribunal, poised, unsmiling. Mr. Delaney was there, hands folded, eyes flicking between the documents on the table. The lead investor, a man named Arjun Patel, spoke first. "Ms. Voss," he said evenly, "we've reviewed the audit, the compliance findings, and your communication logs. Would you like to explain the inconsistencies before we move forward?" Clara's tone was fragile but rehearsed. There were irregularities in client records under Ms. Sinclair's management. I acted in good faith to protect the firm's reputation. Patel nodded once. And did you have authorization to access her accounts or alter her files? A pause. Not explicitly. He turned a page. Then you violated data policy. She hesitated. But my intent, Patel interrupted softly, is not a mitigating factor under the investor clause. Her voice cracked. I didn't know it would trigger the clause. Delaney leaned forward, voice steady. That's the point, Clara. You didn't know because you acted without understanding the architecture you were tampering with. You CC'd HR, the partners and clients tied to Marcelone Equity. That single email forced an investor disclosure review. You created reputational risk, not Ava. Her composure broke then. A small, involuntary sound, half laugh, half breath. You're protecting her, she whispered. No, Patel said, glancing briefly at me. We're protecting the firm. The legal officer slid a document across the table, a termination acknowledgement under the investor compliance clause. It wasn't loud or cruel, just a thin folder and a signature line that ended a career. Clara stared at it for a long time, as if hoping the letters would rearrange themselves. Then she looked up at me, eyes burning with a mix of hatred and disbelief. You planned this, she said quietly. I held her gaze, voice calm. You started it. She didn't sign immediately. Her hand hovered over the page, trembling slightly. When she finally pressed the pen down, the sound of the signature felt like the closing of a vault. Final, mechanical, absolute. Afterward, she stood, smoothed her jacket, and said nothing more. She walked out with the same poise she'd always carried, but her eyes were empty. When the door closed, Patel turned to me. You understand what this means, Mrs. Sinclair. Marcelone values stability. They'll want you to oversee the next phase of investor relations, effective immediately. It took me a moment to process it. The promotion wasn't victory, it was inheritance. The ashes of someone else's ambition repurposed into responsibility. I nodded. Understood. The meeting ended. Papers shuffled. Voices returned to polite neutrality. But beneath the formality, there was a faint aftertaste, like static before a storm finally breaks. Later that evening, I lingered in the empty office. The city glowed below, rivers of light winding through steel and glass. My reflection hovered over the skyline, two images merging, who I was and who I had become. Clara's desk had already been cleared. Only a faint ring of dust remained where her nameplate used to be. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the empty space, realizing something unsettling. I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance, as if some quiet scale had finally evened out. But deep down, a voice whispered, soft, persistent. In a firm built on power, someone always replaces the fallen. And as the elevator doors closed behind me, I wondered, had I won, or had I just inherited her war? When the dust settled, the silence felt heavier than the chaos that came before it. My office door stayed closed that morning, not in fear, but in quiet reflection. The boardroom across the hall still carried the echoes of the previous night, the gasps, the stifled apologies, the frantic shuffling of papers as years of deceit collapsed in real time. Eleanor's seat was empty now, her nameplate removed, her parking spot reassigned to visitor. HR called it a necessary restructuring. The truth was simpler. The empire she built on intimidation had crumbled. Beneath her own arrogance, the investors were calm, almost eerily so. They'd reviewed the audit, seen the losses buried in Eleanor's project roll-ups, and agreed to invoke the clause she never read. The same clause I had helped draft years ago when I was still her trusted analyst. A quiet line about fiduciary misrepresentation leading to automatic termination and forfeiture of equity. It was poetic, really. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to gloat. The numbers spoke for me. When the press release went live, the market responded exactly as expected. Investor confidence surged. Our merger partners re-engaged. And the board, those same men who once doubted my restraint, now looked at me with something new. Respect. That evening, as the sun dipped below the glass towers, I stood by the window and watched the city breathe again. The storm was over. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I wasn't ashamed either. It wasn't vengeance. It was balance. Eleanor had always said, "The market rewards those who act first." She wasn't wrong. She just never realized that patience could be the deadliest move of all. When the new title came, acting head of M&A, I didn't smile. I just nodded, closed the file in front of me, and whispered to myself, checkmate. Because in corporate warfare, revenge isn't loud. It's silent, precise, and beautifully timed. That night, I walked through the empty office one last time before heading home. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above me, casting long reflections over the polished floors. Every desk, every file, every echo of laughter or tension felt like a memory frozen in glass. Eleanor's mug still sat abandoned near the break room sink. "Boss lady," chipped at the edge. I didn't touch it. Some ghosts deserve to stay where they fell. When the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored panel. The same woman who once second-guessed every move now stared back with quiet certainty. I hadn't just survived the game. I'd rewritten it. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that boardroom not as the shadow behind the deals, but as the architect of every decision that followed. And as the doors opened to the street below, I whispered to myself, this was never revenge. It was justice served in silence.